Okay, I'm back talking about chapter 3. So, I was just talking about how the relationship between the reader and the writer is developed by the reader's ability to connect to the author. He discusses fieldwork and field notes as raw data, and that each ethnographer does and should develop their own way of taking notes. So it has to be something that makes sense to you. But one thing that's really important in this process is slowing down, which is something I need to do because I just ran down and up 3 flights of stairs to get a pizza. Okay, so he also discusses in your field work, in your field notes, that it's less about what you see and it's more about connecting it to self-reflexive issues. So again, being reflexive and connecting that to what you notice. Field notes are notes about what gets done. So this is all about forms of representation. None of them are free from interpretation. So all of these notes about what is getting done, you are observing and interpreting the things that are getting done based upon the cultural context and what you have been socialized to learn and understand about what a particular context means. So you're always kind of coding and understanding interactions of other people based upon those cultural contexts and constraints that have been learned. So none of this is free from interpretation. And as such, we should write ourselves into these stories as well, because we have to be mindful and aware, and we have to communicate the ways in which that we are interpreting also. He talks about how we should keep diaries for self-reflexive information. So you should have your field notes, and those should attempt to capture and represent the lived experiences of others, but then you should also have diaries with self-reflexive information and professional notebooks. Those professional notebooks are notebooks of what you hear and observe, and those diaries and professional notebooks are your self-reflexive accounts, and you need to have those also so that you can write them in to the more theoretical material that you're writing about when you go to your field notes. It's also important, like I was discussing earlier, to balance your inward and outward accounts. So you have to try to figure out a balance of how much of the self you're going to write into your stories and how much of the external information that you're going to write into your stories. And this allows us to go back and forth when doing academic writing. Importantly, we should always ask, what can our fieldwork represent, not what does it represent. It should not be that prescriptive or that like final. It should always be, what can this represent? And I think that that's a really important question and a really important note to remember, is that the fieldwork, it's about what can this fieldwork represent, not what does it, because obviously it represents a number of different things to different people, and you, being an outsider, can never know what it may represent to the people you're observing, even if it does mean something particular to you as a participant observer. So I really appreciated that. So that, again, it should be less prescriptive and more process-oriented, so more feminine and creative. He discusses varieties of field notes. So there's 3. There's verbal exchanges, and these occur between or among persons. So like your interviews, gossip, arguments, negotiations, dialogues, that type of thing. There's also practices, and he goes really into detail about all of these. I'm not going to go as into detail as he does. I'm just going to kind of hit the high notes. Another variety is practices, and the practices are what members of a culture say and do routinely. In this, we have the notion of everyday practices, and those provide insights into how ordinary people perform the business of their cultural knowledge. So the idea of observing and participating, ethnography, in cultural practices is central to the development of field notes. You got to get in there, you have to participate, you have to observe, you have to be a part of those daily practices. And then he goes more in detail about this, talking about everyday life performances, about rituals, about rites of passage, about routines. He then goes on to discuss implied, inferred, or interpreted connections between and among verbal exchanges and practices. And then he goes to talk about, well, what should the field notes look like? Again, there's no prescribed format. You have to figure out what it looks like for you. And he talks about, how do you translate those field notes into interesting academic tales? Well, you do it to the best of your ability, but you have to write in order to find that groove and in order to find your style. You have to write to learn how to write. But you also have to read. You have to know where your writing can fill a gap. He then talks about coding, analyzing, and making connections to writing stories, discussing how every ethnographic account tells two stories. So it's the story of you as a researcher, as a person, and the story of those that you observe. And that writing is writing of a story of culture. So ethnographic writing is you're writing the story, a story, not the story, but a story of culture. You would never want to write the story. The same way he discusses what field notes can be, not what they are. So what they are would be what culture is, but what they can be is what culture may be or can be or is to maybe some people. He goes on to, in chapter 4, talk about voice, reflexivity, and character. So he is discussing persona, and this whole chapter is about developing persona and authorial character or voice. So it's how does your persona narrate a story? What does that communicate about you and the type of person that you are? A character is who you are, and these are writerly and readerly constructions. So a character as a writerly construct is that the person as a writer reveals and constructs him or herself in the narrative, who they construct themselves to be in the narrative. And again, it's important to consider your fixed position, so your identity, so your age, race, gender, sexuality, nationality, class, all those kind of identity factors. And then you also have to consider your subject positions, which are your personal experiences. And then you also have to consider your textual positions, so the choices of language that you choose to use. So how do the words that you use communicate your distance or closeness to the subject, and how do your language choices communicate the way you feel about your subject? And it's really, this is kind of about pathos, so it's a lot about your emotional intensity, the textual positions. Talking about how readers interpret characters, and this is the portion in which he gets into the soul. And so he's talking about good ethnographic writing has soul, and there's two parts to this. One is that the language that is used creates deep, intimate relationships between and among people, and then it's also it's you as a writer opening up a deep personal space from which to create understanding. So it's all about, again, those emotional appeals and really trying to get to your audience and to get to yourself, right? Again, reflexivity and voice are going to be paramount in kind of figuring out your character and kind of figuring out what your voice as a writer is, but also being reflexive. So you've got to always, in being your reflexive accounts are about what happened in me or to me, so being sure that you're including those. And then the voice he goes on to define as a personal rhetorical imprint of who we are in and on what we write. He talks about original voices and that all voice is derivative, but that when people say that they are reading or hearing an original voice, it simply means that the person has not encountered that type of voice in their life or experience so far, but that there's no such thing as an original. There is no such thing as a solitary genius. It's everything is derivative. The voice is derivative, but there are manners in which you can develop an original voice, but the original voice is dependent upon a person reading who has not heard that voice before or encountered that voice before. So again, self-reflexive writing, key. Self-reflexivity is going to be paramount in ethnographic writing, and the self-reflexive writing is about coming to terms with your positionality as well. So how much of your positionality do you write into the story that you're writing? How much is important? What is absolutely necessary? And that also gets us thinking about what is an ethical amount of sharing about who you are with the people. So again, another great transition, because chapter 5 is the ethics of writing ethnography. So a few key questions here. How do you gain appropriate entry into a site? How do you legitimately gain the confidence and trust of your informants? And how do you conceal or reveal, so we were just talking about with the self-reflexivity things and coming to terms with your positionality and identity, your identity and ethnographic purpose. So he lists a bunch of different questions here. He continues to talk about your positionality in everyday life. He talks about how you should handle intimacy, how should you represent in your writing the people and the experiences and the rituals and processes and practices that you encounter. What should you do with information that may be really sensitive to the community, that could damage them in some way? So maybe they're doing things that are immoral or unethical. Immoral. Sorry, I got stuck on thinking about what does and does not constitute immoral. And then should you give something back to the people you study? Which is something, honestly, that I had not thought about. And then in that moment I was like, wow, am I like really self-absorbed by not thinking about that? But that I really do feel like already I'm receiving so much from these women that I'm studying in my own ethnographic research, these women of the psychic movement. I think that is because there's like this kind of spiritual growth that comes along with those spaces that I'm really attracted to. And so I think that, which, yes, I have to maintain to not be the enthusiast, but I think that I definitely feel like I am getting a lot from them, and just them inviting me into their world to study them. And so how can I give back is an interesting question I hadn't not thought about before. Don't plagiarize. That's important. Don't appropriate. Also important. Represent cultures ethically and figure out what representation even means. And do that relationally. So not like, again, not like really finite or prescriptive, but think about it metonymically and relationally. Ethical choices are all about who owns the right to the story. So you got to get permission to conduct your research, first of all. And you have to reveal your position as an ethnographer. Just have to do it. More things that are important in this chapter. Oh, talking about your references page and how style is political, like the style in which you choose to write says something about your ideologies. And also you have to read your sources in their entirety if you're going to include them on your references page. Don't just include references that are going to fluff things up. Like, make sure that they are key to what you're doing. One important ethical question that Goodall talks about is how to apply equitably to new ethnographies the standards applied to traditional accounts. So we got to think the new ethnography is not the traditional ethnography. So do we use the same set of ethics whenever we're writing the new ethnography? And don't we? What changes? What happens with that? Because we want to use appropriate language and we want to be self-reflexive. He also talks about the importance of editing, and that there's things that you should always edit, like you should check to make sure your information is factual by getting maybe the participants that you observed to kind of read over things and say, yes, I think that this is ethical and you're on the right track here. You need to edit the way that you've interpreted things. You need to edit overly long sentences and grammar and formatting and aesthetic formatting. But then there's also things that you can add. And those things is there new interpretive material that maybe would help make sense of this? New self-reflexive material, new references? So considering all these things as well whenever you're writing. At the end of the day, the most important thing to remember is that authors are accountable for what they have written. So once you write something, publish something, you're accountable for that. So you want to be sure you're being as critical and self-reflexive about what you write as possible. He wraps this up by talking about the future of new ethnographic writing, asking, well, why do we read ethnographies? What does it mean to read them? What are we reading for? What standards should we use to evaluate their scholarly worth? So we have to understand our purposes for writing. All this is about, why are we writing? Why do we care? Who cares? So we have to understand our purposes for writing. We have to understand our purposes for reading, too. So for Goodall, you can't write without reading, and you can't read without writing. Actually, can you read without writing? Yeah, you can probably read without writing, but you can't write without reading. So reading practices characterize how you read. He talks about how some new writers may just write in the format of their favorite or most recently read author. He, wants you to ask, like, what do you get out of reading? Why are you reading in the first place? Is it because you have to? Is it because you want to? Is it because you love a certain genre or a certain author? Why are you reading? So why? Why do you read in the first place? And that you can learn from asking these questions. And you have to also ask, what is it about ethnographic writing that induces you to learn? Like, is it because you're emotionally charged or stimulated or challenged? Or is it because you're intellectually challenged? And then maybe that can help you develop your own kind of writing style. So, I did put a star next to all this stuff about spirituality of community, the Goodall and Hawker Rushing stuff, it's not really relevant to this outline, but I think it'd be relevant to my ethnography and for me to read. And he also wants to ask the question, how does or how should the new ethnography make contributions to knowledge? Well, that's always important, and then that goes back to how can you expand upon or add to the scholarship that's already there. And he's talking about how when ethnographic writing is done well, we can learn previously unspoken, unknown things about culture and communication. And that's kind of the goal here, is that we want to learn things that we have not learned previously, and we want to write things that help others learn as well. So kind of at the end of this, we want to author ourself within the context of others. We want to get the truth of our experiences. We want to consider this a method of inquiry. We want to explore ourself in response to questions that can only be answered in that way. And we want to talk about ourselves in relation to the lived experiences of others. Here we go. It says in this chapter that ethnography sometimes challenges a reader's sensibilities. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier when I was like, well, yes, like good writing should meet the expectations of the audience, but I think it's also really productive when it challenges them too. So, yeah, and he also thinks that scholarship is about messing with your head, and that that's a good thing, and that stories, like I was saying earlier, should be metonymic, and there should be purposeful dialogue that's written into there. You should consider affect and influence. You should be self-reflexive, and really at the end of the day, like I was mentioning earlier, that good writing is writing that you would enthusiastically recommend to other people. So he kind of sums up saying, quote, page 197, I think the major problems or challenges facing writers of new ethnographies are those derived from a deep disciplinary misunderstanding of our purpose. So new ethnographers aren't writing to argue with anyone, but they want to have a dialogic ethic and a transformational vision. And he kind of sums up by putting this into a broader context, saying that we learn to read and write the new ethnography, how we learn to read and write the new ethnography will help make those changes in the world and in the academy. So doing things for the better and transforming. That's good all. Hope y'all are all good.